Greetings and welcome back to 303. We are in Senior English A and we are continuing our conversation with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Let's just make sure we kind of know where we have already covered. We've worked with Chaucer general basic information. We've worked with the general prologue, that list of characters who will ultimately tell all these different stories. We've introduced ourselves to the first specific character and story in the partner's prologue and tale. And now we will turn to the wife of Bath. Okay, so let's write that down in our notes at level 1. We are now working with the wife of Bath's tale. We are on page 137 and the before you read information page. Let's just make a couple of quick observations before we actually get into our study. We'll begin at the top of that page with connecting to the essential question. In her tale, the feisty wife of Bath asserts the idea that husbands and wives should be equal in marriage. Let's go ahead and see, your textbook helps you, doesn't it, at level 2A? What is a major theme or message of this text? And there it is, you just read it, that in marriage, wives and husbands should be considered as equal. We'll talk about the attack on the patriarchy here in a little bit. Now, I've already given a lecture on the wife of Bath's prologue. The prologue of the wife of Bath does not occur or is not provided in your anthology. For reasons we'll get into in our conversation in a little bit, and I've already kind of outlined these in an earlier lecture for you. But let's continue here on page 137. As you read, identify passages in which the wife of Bath supports the idea of same self-sovereignty, quote unquote, or equality in marriage. This will help you address the essential question of our unit: how does literature shape or reflect society? Let's quickly jump to 2B really quickly under literary analysis, and you will want to write down frame story. A frame story contains or frames another story or group of stories. In the Canterbury Tales, the frame story is the character's pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral described in the prologue. Within the frame story are the tales told by the characters on their journey. Here are some ways in which the frame story develops a work of literature. Let's bullet point these three things. Individual tales reflect the description of the storyteller's personalities and lives that you find in the frame story. In other words, if we learn something about the wife of Bath, for example, in the prologue, we're then going to have some information about her in the actual prologue of her story, and then of course her story itself. Number 2, a tale may itself contain a frame story and an inner tale. The wife of Bath's tale has such a structure. In other words, it starts to become almost like an onion, or for the Shrek fans, parfait. You've got this layering thing that starts to happen. Finally, the setting of the frame story, the time and place of its action, may not match the settings of individual tales. For example, the events in the prologue occur around Chaucer's time, but the wife of Bath sets her frame story much earlier, during the reign of King Arthur. We're going to want to analyze these interactions, consider their effects as we read the wife of Bath's tale. In the preparing to read complex text reading strategy on page 137, notice you may encounter unfamiliar words while reading. If so, repair your comprehension by checking context clues. I would write that down. Checking context clues, words and phrases in the surrounding passage that shed light on the meaning of a word. Common context clues are synonyms, words that mean the same, antonyms, words that mean the opposite, and examples that clarify a word's meaning. And then, of course, your chart here on page 137 will kind of help you. Finally, I would pause for a moment this video and I would write down really quickly your 6 vocabulary words there, because you can be pretty sure those vocab words are going to end up on the exam later. And as well, when you meet these words in your reading, then they will be much easier for you in terms of understanding. Let's now turn to the wife of Bath's tale. I'm with you on page 139. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say before we actually get into this, and I've already said some of this in the lecture on the wife of Bath's prologue. If you have not watched my wife of Bath's prologue, you definitely want to do that before you actually study this tale. But let's go ahead and summarize really quickly 3 things. We're talking now about the wife of Bath's prologue, which is not provided here. 3 things. 1. Chaucer has a satiric agenda. We've written this down already at 2B several times. Let's write it down again. Chaucer's satiric agenda. He has a project. What is that project? In a word, we might think of it as, let's write it down, reform. Reform. That is to say, Chaucer is challenging certain kinds of understandings. Okay? Now, Chaucer, as we've already said, is an iconoclast. He is iconoclastic. That is to say, he attacks certain kinds of sacred institutions. He has problems. Let's write it this way. He has problems with at least two different institutions or ideas. One, we've mentioned it already, the church. That is to say, when he writes the Partner's Prologue and Tale, he is clearly trying to suggest that the church needs to be reformed, especially with hypocritical priests, okay, or religious. The second thing he's going to attack, we're going to see here in our study of the wife of Bath, and that we will say as simply the patriarchy. The patriarchy. The idea, as I outlined it in an earlier lecture, the idea that men run the world and women have to do what men tell them to do. And again, the origination of much of this idea, we say, is Aristotelian. It comes from the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. And you'll maybe recall in that earlier lecture that you can do this again just to remind yourself and draw a little pyramid on your paper. At the top of that pyramid, you're going to put the gods. Because remember, Aristotle, the time of the Greeks, believes in multiple gods, polytheistic. And then right below the gods, you kind of draw a line, and right below the gods are going to be men. And then right below men, you draw a line underneath men, are going to be women. Now, we said in an earlier lecture, this is an organic view. That is to say, it is of or related to nature. It is natural. It is natural, right? To argue against this natural idea would be conceived as, first of all, insanity, and then secondly, irreligious. Because why? Well, the natural order is instantiated because of the gods for Aristotle. I believe in our earlier lecture I made the observation that if I looked out our window of my room to Ruthie's tree out there and I were to start screaming at it that I wanted to become a Christmas tree to change, you would say to me two things. First of all, you're insane. That tree can't become a Christmas tree. It is what it is. It can't change. But what if I said, I don't like it the way it is, I want it to change? You would say to me, no, you don't understand the world of nature. It is the way it is. The patriarchy by 1400, Common Era, the patriarchy is just kind of accepted as it is the way it is. Chaucer is going to attack this idea, and this makes him in many ways one of the earliest feminist thinkers. Let's write that term down. One of the earliest feminist thinkers. Now, what does feminism mean? Okay, what does that term even mean? In its simplest language, it simply means the attack on the patriarchy. The attack on the idea that women should be subservient to men and that men should be able to tell women what to do. Okay? The attack then on the patriarchy for Chaucer, let's write this down, will be radical. It will be radical. Now in our wife's prologue, 20 pages that we don't have in our anthology, the wife of Bath says several things about being married 5 times. She says, it's terrible. I hated it. And yet I'm looking for my 6th husband because my last husband died. All 5 of my husbands have died. She then goes through a long oration of the ways in which she used to control her men. Now this is of course humorous, but it's also subversive. Because in Chaucer's day, the rule of thumb applied. In the house, there was a stick that could be no larger than the circumference of the thumb of the man of the house, and the point of the stick was so that he could beat his wife. It was accepted that men were to take care of their women, even through violence, if their women did not show proper respect. That is to say, do whatever they're told. So Chaucer's wife of Bath is going to tell a story that is in some ways going to directly attack this idea. All right? Now we're on page 139. We're going to turn now to the reading of the wife of Bath's tale. And we'll be ready now to set up this story. Now, let's write it down at 2b. Let's write it down really quickly. This notion of plot. This notion of plot. Now, you'll remember that we said about the Pardoner's Tale that there's this beginning, this middle, and this end. We're definitely going to see this plot narrative in the story that she's going to tell as well. She's going to have an exposition, a beginning. She's going to kind of set it up. We're going to see who the characters in the story are, right? Then we're going to have some rising action, which will involve some kind of conflict, all right? Then we're going to have a climax, and then ultimately that resolution or that denouement. So let's talk it through now. Here we go on 139. Again, let me challenge you. Don't just listen to me read to you. You could do that when you were very young. Let's follow along yourself. Try and see how well you can read, how well you can keep up with my reading, and you can understand on your own as well. Let's read, shall we? When good King Arthur ruled in ancient days, a king that every Briton loves to praise, this was a land brimful of fairy folk. The elf queen and her courtiers joined and broke their elfin dance on many a green mead, or so was the opinion once I read, hundreds of years ago in days of yore. But no one now sees fairies anymore, for now the saintly charity and prayer of holy friars seem to have purged the air. They search the countryside through field and stream, as thick as motes they speckle a sunbeam, blessing the halls, the chambers, kitchens, bowers, cities and boroughs, castles, courts, and towers, thropes, barns and stables, outhouses and dairies, and that's the reason why there are no fairies. Now, let's just pause for a moment. Chaucer is having a bit of fun here. He has the wife of Bath say, in olden days, there used to be fairies everywhere who kind of made things really good. But now we don't have fairies anymore. Now we have friars. You'll see the similarity between the two words, right? Now we have friars who like to go around blessing everything, even outhouses where you go to the bathroom, even outhouses. Well, what you don't know, and this is the tragedy of not having the Wife of Bath's prologue, is that at the very end of the Wife of Bath's prologue, she and the friar got into it. They had a little bit of an argument. The friar didn't like the way that the Wife of Bath expressed herself in her prologue. And so she's kind of getting a dig in here at the friar. Remember, we met this friar already, the wanton one, and Mary Alimiter, a very festive fellow. Remember, Chaucer says about him, he was the holy pillar of his order. In other words, Chaucer satirically said, he's a really bad guy, but at least he's not as bad as the rest of the guys in that order. Let's keep reading. Whenever there was wont to walk an elf today, there walks the holy friar himself as evening falls or when the daylight springs, line 20, saying his mantons and his holy things, walking his limit round from town to town. Women can now go safely up and down by every bush or under every tree. There is no other incubus but he, so there is really no one else to hurt you, and he will do no more than take your virtue. Whoa! So you can see what she says here. Now today, friars are everywhere. They hide under the bushes. They're by the side of the road, and they're always there to take care of you. And if they can't take care of you, then they'll at least take your virtue. That is to say, they will force you to have sex with them. So already you can see the Wife of Bath, she's saying this about a religious person, and so you can clearly see the Wife of Bath is going to take no prisoners in her tale in the same way that she took no prisoners in her prologue, as we outlined in an earlier lecture. Now, then that's just kind of a little, let me get my jab in on this friar, and now we're ready to go to work. Now, it so happened, I began to say, long, long ago in good King Arthur's day, there was a knight who was a lusty liver. Now, by this we mean that he enjoys the company of women. So let's write this down at level 1. Two things. One, we are going to have a knight, right, as being the key player in our story. Now this is interesting because, of course, Chaucer has in his general prologue a knight, remember, and the son of a knight. We're told about that knight that he's a really good guy. He's seen the world. He's traveled far and wide. Notice our knight here is going to be a guy who enjoys the company of women. But remember, there is a knight's code, and knights are supposed to treat women with respect. That's the understanding of the Arthurian Code, as we will talk about it later when we meet our study of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. But notice at line 30 we're told about this knight. One day, as he came riding from the river, he saw a maiden walking all forlorn ahead of him, alone as she was born. And of that maiden, spite of all she said, by very force, he took her maidenhead. Whoa, so let's go ahead and write this down. We are in some radical territory for 1350. Let's just say this out loud. The knight, driving down the road on his pony, looks up, sees a pretty girl, a young maiden, and forces her to have sex with him. He rapes her. So this is where we are. So the wife of Bath's tale will right away begin with some controversial material. That is to say, there once was this knight back in King Arthur's day, and he saw this pretty girl by the side of the road. She's all by herself, and he raped her. You can already imagine, for example, that some of the people in the entourage are going to be like, whoa, what kind of story are you telling here? But we'll understand a little bit more about this story and the approach of the story once we understand the prologue, and we'll get into the story itself. This, line 35, this act of violence made such a stir, so much petitioning of the king for her, that he condemned the knight to lose his head by course of law. He was as good as dead. It seems that then the statutes took that view, but that the queen and the other ladies too implored the king to exercise his grace so ceaselessly. He gave the queen the case and granted her his life, and she could choose whether to show him mercy or refuse. Let's write down two things here that are of interest. One, the king hears about this knight raping a young girl, and he says the knight has to have his head chopped off. The queen and the women who support the queen will come to the king and say, please don't kill him. Let us instead have some decision in the judgment of what happens to the knight. And the king will say, do whatever you want. Now this is very subtle for the wife of Bath already. She will have in a story very early on a king who is willing to let his queen make the rules. Let's write that down. That already is going to be significant. If you remember from my earlier lecture on the wife of Bath's prologue, she says that the one thing that she wanted more than anything when she had husbands was to control them and tell them what to do. And again, we went through this in an earlier lecture, any number of things that she said she used, different ways she used to control her husbands. Notice here, the king says to the queen, do whatever you want, I don't care. You guys decide what you want to do. I'm on page 140 now. Page 140, line 45. The queen returned him thanks with all her might, and then she sent a summons to the knight at her convenience and expressed her will. You stand for such is the position still, in no way certain of your life, said she. Yet you shall live if you can answer me, what is the thing that women most desire? Beware the acts and say as I require. Let's write it down at level 1 really quickly. So the queen calls the knight in front of her, and she says, here's the deal. We're going to chop your head off, just like the king was going to, unless you can give us, the women of the court, the answer to a very simple question. What is the one thing all women most desire? What is that? So if you can give us the answer to that, and all the women in the court can agree, then you save your life. If you can't, on the moment though, she says, I will concede you this. You are to go a 12-month and a day, a year and a day, to seek and learn sufficient answer, then you shall return. I shall take gages from you to extort surrender of your body to the court. That is to say, I've got to have a guarantee that you're not going to run away. So let's go ahead and put it in our notes really quickly at level 1. We can block this story very, very easily. Again, these are very simple stories, just like the partner story. It begins with a knight raping a young girl. It then follows that the king says he's got to have his head chopped off. You can't treat women like that. The queen says, this knight is just too good looking to chop off a pretty head like that. Instead, we're going to give him a mission. We're going to tell him he has to spend a year and a day and find the answer to the question, what is it that all women most want? What is it they most desire? He's got to come back at the end of a year. He's got to give us the answer. If he gives us the right answer, he doesn't lose his head. If he gives us the wrong answer, off with his head. Sad, as you can imagine, sad was the knight, and sorrowfully sighed. But there, all other choices were denied, and in the end he chose to go away and to return after a year and a day, armed with such answer as there might be sent to him by God. He took his leave and went. So let's pause for a moment. We understand at level 1 what's going on here. This is a very simple question. What is it that every single woman wants most? Now we could quickly jump down to 3b and jot down what you think the answer is. Can you provide an answer to the question, what do all women want? Not some women, all women. Is it possible that you could say there is something all women want? Okay? This is, of course, going to be the nasty dilemma that the knight is in. And, of course, because he is male and not female, he's going to have to spend a year. And what is he going to do? Research. How's he going to do research? He's going to go around, and obviously he's going to ask a bunch of women, what do you really want? What's the most important thing in your life that you really want? Let's go ahead now and continue. I'm at line 65. He knocked at every house, searched every place. Yes, anywhere that that offered hope of grace. What could it be that women wanted most? But all the same, he never touched a coast, country, or town in which there seemed to be any two people willing to agree. So let's just put it in our notes really quickly at level 1. He goes up to women all over the place and he asks, hey, what do you want? And they'll give an answer. And they ask another woman, what do you want? And then she'll give an answer. He says, I can't get any two women to tell me that would agree what it is all women most desire. And now you have an interesting list here, okay? This is a list of some of the things that women most desire. Some of this you'll want to write down at level 1. I'm with you at line 71. Some said that women wanted wealth and treasure. Honor, said some. Some, jollity and